So I went to University of Michigan. My tuition the first year I went was $382. I was a carpenter making $10 an hour. So in 2 weeks, I could pay for a year of tuition at the University of Michigan.
Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you. Welcome to the Party Pal. This is Fountainhead Forum 291. I'm talking to Joshua Mitchell, who has long time been a professor at Georgetown University. He's also very much a scholar of Alexis de Tocqueville, which is certainly Democracy in America is definitely a set of books lots of Americans should read. And he's also currently the author of a book called American Awakening, Identity, Politics, and Other Afflictions Over Time. How are you, Joshua?
I'm fine. How are you, Chris?
Yeah, you've had an interesting history. When did your academic career begin, and how have things changed over that period?
Well, I should give you the full story. My dad was a professor, so my academic memory goes back to I'd say mid 60s. And what happened in the late 60s and early 70s was, in the name of having a more pluralistic academic culture, a lot of lefties were let in and became professors. And when they got tenure, they were not really interested in having, I'll call it a broad university intellectually. And so what's happened is, slowly but surely, since the early 70s, conservatives have been quietly pushed out. They don't hire, they don't replace. And so in academic life now, probably 95% of all faculty and administrators, because that's important, are now members of the Democratic Party. I characterize universities as the academic wing of the Democratic National Committee.
Yeah, plus I also believe that just from, say, 65 to 75, there was also very much an increase in attendance. So there were a lot of professors being hired too.
Yeah, that was the great demographic boom, upswing. And it's now, dropping down. But I don't see, as much as I would love to say that universities are responding to this new moment, which we can't quite name, but which is clearly against identity politics of the left, universities will not respond. They're going to double down. That's very sad, but That's what's going to happen.
Yeah, I got to know, what was can you give me, I've always liked to ask this, what was, say, tuition back when you started, as an undergrad?
So I went to University of Michigan. My tuition the first year I went was $382. I was a carpenter making $10 an hour. So in 2 weeks, I could pay for a year of tuition at the University of Michigan.
That's crazy. Yeah. And that's in Ann Arbor. Yeah. So now it's not even close to that anymore. Yeah. When was that? The late 60s or early 70s or?
It would have been sort of mid 70s, maybe 77. No, 75. Yeah. Something like that. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. So, and since then we've seen this massive increase. What do you think are some of the things that account for the massive increase? I mean, obviously, the fact that college is now seen as a right, at least as far as some people are concerned. Whereas,
yeah. So, use economic terms. There's demand and there's effectual demand. And the problem was, a lot of people wanted to go to college. They didn't have the money. So the government, because it's largely committed to the dogma of equality, as Tocqueville put it, provided huge sums of money for students to go to college, and every college president saw dollar signs and jacked up the tuition. And so we've had a never-ending arms race to increase tuition and increase student aid. And I'll add, and I mentioned a little bit about this earlier, the deeply pernicious part is, in a way, it's worse than the professors. It's the administrators. You've got this huge support network, I put that in quotes, for young people. And the assumption is that these young people are infantilized, need counseling, need safe spaces. And so you've got a group of students who've grown up K through 12 and now in college who are really infantilized. And it's very, very expensive to keep that operation going. I think if you were to cut out all federal funding of universities, very quickly, we would discover whether universities are committed to the academic mission as it should be, or whether they're committed to infantilizing students and continuing to support the administration.
Joshua, this seems like a trend, though, not just outside the colleges, of infantilizing society. I mean, I've said this too many times on this show, but my grandfather, as a first grader, walked to school 2 miles each way. We
Yeah.
Kids were expected to do things, and they got more competent. And now there's just this whole extension of childhood that's really gotten ridiculous. And
Yeah. So it's certainly, so Tocqueville writes the second volume of Democracy in America in 1840. And in one of the concluding chapters, he predicts a very dystopian future in which citizens will be completely infantilized. All they will care about is entertainment, and the state will grow stronger and stronger while citizens lose the links between one another. That is his dystopian future. But, you can even push it back further than that. I'm not a huge fan of Rousseau, but in 1760, Rousseau writes this book called Emile, which is on education of young children. And he sees even then that this infantilization is happening. And it happens as technology gets more sophisticated, and we think we can cheat death and get rid of suffering. That's the problem. And we can't.
that is an interesting way to look at it, because it seems like it has in a lot of ways made us soft. I mean, I've just noticed the differences. And even my much older brothers would say things to me, that I was being coddled more than they were. It's, another factor too is, somebody once pointed out, back in the 60s, most college freshmen had shared a bedroom, and now most college freshmen have never shared a bedroom.
Yeah.
But then they go into a dorm and they're sharing a dorm with somebody. It's like, oh yeah, this is a new experience.
So that's another thing, I think, that another factor that explains the coddling. If you've got 7 or 8 siblings, you might lose one, and it's a terrible thing, but life moves on. If you're a single child or only have one sibling, boy, there's a lot of investment in those kids, and so you're going to try and keep them away from suffering, and so that I think is part of the reason why we've moved in this direction too.
Yeah, I remember it was Blake Bowles who calls it snowplow parenting. You're always pushing out the snowplow and making things. You're making things as easy as possible with the kids, and therefore they never really learn to struggle. They never really learn, to walk in the snow, and therefore they're kind of. It really is. I mean, and it's really, in fact, as we've gotten richer, it's I see when I go to a poor country like Peru, I'll see, a 5 or 6 year old kid paddling a canoe on the river. And if they were, and this might be a river as big as the Ohio River or the Potomac. And if there was a 6-year-old in DC rowing a canoe on the Potomac, it would be a media circus. Oh my God, that kid's paddling a canoe. You've been at Georgetown for a while. What have you seen change at Georgetown, during your time?
I got there in 93, and I think the students were better prepared. So I teach the same text that I taught in 93, but I routinely think as I'm lecturing, well, these kids can't follow this. They can't go this deep. And so I've watered down what I teach a little bit, and I'm very troubled by it. The other thing that's interesting on a more social level is that you used to see in the early 90s boys and girls holding hands. And then there was this immense period where they crowded together. So the idea of boyfriends and girlfriends, that's kind of disappeared. I told my students the other day that for the first time in 15 years, I saw a boy and a girl holding hands walking through Georgetown. It's really remarkable. The young boys and young girls don't know how to hook up is not the word I'm looking for. They don't know how to match up. Because the very idea that there might be something that's, that we can count on a man to be and count on a woman to be, all that's largely gone. And so you've got these two quivering creatures, almost different species, who have no formula for engaging one another. And so I think that's part of the reason why we have a natality crisis, why especially young women don't seem to be interested in getting married and having children. This is a huge problem for America.
Well, Joshua, wouldn't you also, I suppose if you're like most colleges, though, you've probably seen an exodus of males, period, right?
We're probably 60 to 64% female now at Georgetown. There was probably a slight preponderance of men when I got there in '93. The saying "the future is female" is playing out on our colleges across the country, with a few exceptions.
You've talked about identity politics, but I talk about this a lot because it's hit me in my personal life, and it's what I call the culture of false accusations. There was a time if a man approached a woman and she wasn't interested, she would say no. He would say, "Have a good day," and quietly walk away, and that would be the end of it. But now, yeah, and the cliche was the worst thing that can happen is she says no.
Yeah,
It's not that way anymore.
no,
You
this
might
is
be accused of, oh, that guy harassed me, throw him out of the class, or and I don't think it happens very often. In the nature where a female goes to the police to talk about this, but like getting somebody thrown out of a conference, thrown out of class, or something like this, I think that happens a lot, or just social circles.
Yeah. So the way I set it up in the book American Awakening, I say we really have two grand alternatives. Well, one's grand and the other is pernicious. One is what I call the politics of competence, where we're working with one another and evaluating one another on the basis of how competent we are and how competent the other person is. And then the other one is identity politics, which is the politics of innocent victimhood. And the problem with the politics of innocent victimhood is that literally the only way your voice can be heard is if you are a victim. And I think young kids today are thinking through this very carefully. I do think that some of the transgender stuff is very much about, we'll call them normies, young boys and young girls, especially if they're white, realizing that they are invisible in the culture of innocent victimhood. And so what they have to do is be able to wear the mantle of innocent victimhood. I think the climate change thing is in some measure this too. So, I'm just a normal white kid from the suburbs, but no, I am a victim of carbon dioxide and fossil fuels. So I think what has been drummed into the minds and hearts of this younger generation is the only way they can be seen is if they are some kind of a victim. And so this points back to the problem of women, needing to be seen. And how do they become seen? By claiming that they're an innocent victim of some harassment. Now, there is harassment, to be sure, but this is a phenomena that I think we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I definitely is. There's not real. I remember when the guy landed that ship on the comet, and that was just this amazing accomplishment. And then they had to and then the media makes a big sting about the shirt he was wearing. I mean, and we're really getting to a point too where we're not. Like Peter Thiel likes to say, we've outlawed technology. I don't think we're having the achievements that we used to have, and not to mention all of this involves taking risks. You know, you
So
you know,
yeah,
like
I think
flying the first airplane was a risk.
yeah. So I see it in a number of ways. One is geopolitical. What I mean by that is the whole history of the world is nations competing against one another, and therefore citizens developing competence in order to compete. After 1989, the United States was a single world power. And I think we kind of gave up on never-ending competence. We just thought we would be the ascendant power forever. And so you can see the silver lining here, which is to say, once we return to a competition between nations, US against China being an
Yeah,
obvious one, then I think some of this will have to go away, because we either return to competence or we die. But America was in this period for, since 1989, where a lot of people just gave up on that and thought now that the only problem left to solve is the problem of the innocent victim. And the way we'll do this is with identity politics.
yeah, yeah. That's a good point. And I can remember, watching the Olympics when when going up against the evil empire, and just wanting to beat them, in hockey or beat them anywhere else, and certainly that's what got the space program going. Oh, let's
Yeah.
get a man on the moon before they do. There was a certain competition there, and I think isn't really a villain at the Olympics anymore. certainly as
Right.
much as, I mean,
So back to the space race. I don't think we're going to get. I mean, I'm cheering on Elon Musk, needless to say, to go to Mars, but I don't think we're going to get a serious space race until the planets can be colonized, until a country says this is mine. This is the way it worked, in the age of exploration, and of course there were terrible consequences. But there was a treaty signed, I think, in the late '60s, which said basically nobody will own these planets. Well, if nobody's going to own these planets, then it's not open to ambition, and we kind of gave up in a way. We stopped world history by saying we're done with ownership, done with competition. So I don't think we're going to get really started. So until we get competition again, if the Chinese go to the moon and plant a flag and say, this is mine, you can bet we will develop scientific competence to exceed them very soon.
and I think competition in healthy forms can be a very beautiful thing. I mean, I don't know how much you pay attention to, but growing up as a teenager in the 80s, I just remember, when Bird and Johnson started out, they hated each other. And by the time they retired, they were best friends.
Yeah.
And they just played, and, because you get into that competition, and you just see yourself, boy, that damn guy's working so hard. I got to work hard too. And eventually you realize there's a respect that comes out of that.
Yeah.
So,
to come back to universities,
I was partial to Johnson, but
yeah. Sure. I think part of the reason why there isn't so much competition, say at the university level, is we've got tremendous grade inflation. So if you don't have to work hard to get an A, why would you work hard at all? And I think we have to return to making serious gradations between students to let them know that, no, to get an A, you really have to earn it. But that's not where we are now at universities.
Well, I never thought much about that. That is one area where I still think you see competition, you see leadership, and you see competence being rewarded is in sports. Yeah. It's really the only thing left, and of course, Georgetown, of course, has long had that had their reputation as a basketball school. So,
yeah.
It's. I mean, I do. This is. We. How do you think we get back to? It seems to me too. I just know from being out in the real world, I don't think competence is rewarded. I think you get ahead in the real world by just being by playing politics, no matter where it is, private sector or wherever, schmoozing the supervisors and telling the people in charge how great they are.
Yeah. So I don't think we get back to this until actions that are harmful are rewarded accordingly, and actions that are helpful are praised. We're living in a world where there's no consequences, and that's a problem. And I think we have to bump into things and realize, well, that's not going to work. And I'll add here that I think young people are more frightened than they've ever been. So I'm a few years older than you, but I was a carpenter for a while. I was a musician on the road. I never thought that if I stepped off the main track, it was fatal. But I think students now are so petrified. There's a phrase that goes around on college campuses: Yale or jail. Either you're going to follow the right track and never step off and never make a mistake, and if you don't do that, then it's all over for you. And one of the things I tell my students is failure is the best thing that can ever happen to you. And they're petrified of this, and they've never heard this, but you really learn a lot when you come to a dead end. And I was a musician, a reasonably good one, but I realized at one point that this is not going to work, and so I went off to graduate school. That's a very important lesson in life. So we're living in a world without consequences and without failures. Too big to fail. I mean, it's a great example, right? The big banks. My view is that too big to fail, that whole enterprise in 2008, was a consequence of a long cultural movement where we were scared of failure at all. And we have to have failures, and the big banks should have been punished in a serious way, moral hazard, so that the mid-sized banks come in and take their place. Instead, now we've got more concentration of wealth than we've had ever since 2008.
Well, if kids were, look at, every kid falls when they learn to walk. I mean, or at least I assume they do. I mean, that's failure right there. And it's interesting how kids, at least starting out, can just say, I get knocked down, I get up again. And
Yeah.
and that's a big deal. That's a really big deal for kids when they learn to walk. It's
Yeah.
and you also realize that at up to a certain age, kids go after difficulty. They because everything's
Yeah.
difficult, so they just don't have a choice. I just wonder what happens with that. It's
Yeah. Well, then parents help them unlearn that lesson. I would put
yeah.
it that way, by coddling them.
And I sometimes when I see kids up to 6, I said, when you're up to 6, falling down is fun. It's like, and kids do seem to have fun falling down. It's
Yeah.
just what they're
Yeah.
willing to do. But we've also just created this whole culture of safety. And this is another thing too, though. I growing up when I was born in the early 70s, and I knew some kids who got broken arms, but nowadays if a kid is just climbing the trees and falls and breaks his arm and has got to go to the hospital, that kid's going to go into a room for 3 hours and get the 3rd, 4th, and 5th degree from some do-gooders who are looking for abuse.
Yeah. No, that's true. So the way I tell it is, if one of my friends had shown up with a bicycle helmet in the late 60s, we probably would have beat him up, because the view was, no, you're going to bang yourself up and you're going to hit your head on the curb. And that's the rite of passage to be a young person.
Yeah, and sometimes I wonder if these rites of passages are necessary. It's and of course, lawn darts. Go back and
Right.
remember
Oh,
lawn
yeah.
darts.
All the good stuff.
And unfortunately, too, I think for some kids, part of the thrill was, well, yeah, this is a little bit dangerous, isn't it? It's whether it be jumping off the wall or climbing trees. There's always it seems like kids learn to navigate risk, and now we've just made them afraid of everything. And I don't know. I don't know how we undo that. It's really weird.
We have to fail.
Yeah, we
realize.
have to fail. I mean, if I had a 10-year-old boy and I'd just say to him and say, fail fast and fail often.
Yeah, that's right.
Joshua, you mentioned that a lot of younger men are just done with this. Is that true now?
Yeah, I think when you I have to give the theological backdrop of this, because I don't think identity politics can be understood except as a Christian heresy, which is kind of in the book, but I think I've seen this more clearly. So, what sustained Christian civilization for, I don't know, call it 2,000 years, was the idea that human beings are sinners, but there's redemption. So there's original sin, but then there's the divine gift. And whether you believe that or not, it did sustain a civilization. The problem with identity politics is it takes from Christianity the idea that there's irredeemable stain, hence the term the deplorables or the irredeemables.
Yeah.
This to me is not an accident. Hillary Clinton is an old Methodist, and so she's using these theological terms. And the problem then is it takes from Christianity the idea that there's irredeemable sin, but it rejects from Christianity that there's an escape from it. So what you have is a young generation of what I call the prime transgressors. And the prime transgressors are white heterosexual men. Sometimes, they add the Christian part. But those guys are ground zero. There's nothing they can do because they're just born stained and irredeemable. And I think there are a couple of different responses. One is to not be, as it were, a masculine man. And I do think the Democratic Party now specializes in that, the Tim Walzes of the world.
Oh gosh, yes.
But I think another response, and this is largely conservative young men, they've now come to the point where they just don't want to hear it. They're done. They're literally not talking to people who make those accusations. They're fighting mad, and I'm a little nervous about this group because a group of angry young men can do a lot of damage. Yeah. But I say to the left, what really did you expect when for the last 15 years, and I have sons who are now in their mid to late 30s, and this happened even to them a long time ago. When you say the future is female, that men are irredeemably stained, that to be white is a mark of stain. And when you do that, after a while, I mean, some people are going to cower, and that's one type of man. Another type of man is going to say, well, no, we're not doing this anymore. And that's That's the MAGA base. They're really, really angry. I tried to tell my friends on the left, friends and family on the left, I said, listen, none of this had to happen. But when you kept doubling down and saying, no, patriarchy really is the problem. No, men are toxic. Toxic masculinities are central civilization problem. You keep going on this, and you don't realize that these are human beings too. And you, by the way, are just as stained as they are. You're going to get a backlash. And I think the MAGA movement must be understood as a kind of declaration of independence from a pathology that I think dates really to the 60s. I mean, feminism, I think, is a large part of this. And you're probably wondering why I'm not saying the civil rights movement. Because in the 1950s, I happen to know this because I know some old civil rights guys, Black civil rights guys. In the 1950s, it was suggested to some of the leaders of the African-American community, well, you can use this innocent victimhood status to your advantage. And from what I understand, they said, no, we are not going to see ourselves as innocent victims. So, but now later on, and I think even now that was appropriated. And one of the interesting things in Black America is that if you look at, the arguments of the early part of the 20th century, they had huge disagreements. Some wanted to leave America, some wanted to fight back against America, some wanted to be loyal citizens. But what was uniform was that all the Black American leaders believed that they had the capacity to act. And the deep pathology, at least among, I'll call it elite Black culture on the left, is that the language and the trope of identity politics supposes that there is no agency, that in fact, the only way Blacks can be rescued is if whites stop being racist. Now, this is deeply pernicious, and it suggests that Blacks must depend upon the state for everything. This is somewhat developed by John Sibley Butler and other Black scholars. Because the state was against Black America, they had to be the Tocquevillian Americans, meaning they formed this incredible informal networks of churches and families. And that's what Tocqueville says you must do in order to oppose tyranny. So Black America for a long time were Tocquevillian Americans. And then the 60s destroyed the whole thing, because what it did, all these programs basically supplanted the churches and the families, and in exactly a Tocquevillian fashion, infantilized a sufficiently large number of Black Americans that group as a whole is in trouble. Now, there's obviously many, many exceptions to this, but Tocqueville would have predicted exactly what happened, which is if the state steps in and usurps the role of the mediating institutions, which Blacks had a very strong version of course you get infantilized citizens. It's not about Black here. It's about what happens to citizens, whatever their color might be.
Well, it also raises the question, no more fathers in the home.
Yes, right. So the fastest way to produce an infantilized, incompetent citizenry is to destroy the family and the male in the family. You have to there must be male socialization, or the whole thing falls apart. And I think the war on patriarchy, the war on men, the unintended consequences, or maybe the intended, I don't know, but the consequences of this is to destroy the family. And I'll add one other thing. If you want to be general, you would say that, men tend to draw lines and say, no, can't do that. And generally women tend to be empathetic. And the border debate about, whether you have open borders or not, is in my view, a confirmation of the problem. So I think a lot of women on the left will say, well, we have to have open borders because everybody's a human being. Or on the transgender thing, well, we have to be empathetic to everybody. And men are saying, no, there's a line to be drawn. So on the border debate, I would say there is this thing called justice. That's rule of law. That means if you come into the country illegally, you're going. You are being moved out of the country. Sorry, no questions asked, no empathy. But justice alone, though, can't stand. You have to have mercy, the kind of female principle, as a supplement. And now we're talking about supplements and substitutes. You need to have that as a supplementary principle. So yes, we have rule of law, and then we'll be merciful for true political prisoners, so to speak, or people who are at risk in other countries. I'm perfectly satisfied with that. But we've so messed up the relationship between justice and mercy because we've turned mercy, or rather the left has turned mercy into a substitute for justice. That's a very, very deep pathology.
Yeah.
And I think people are kind of whispering about this. When there's a 58% gap between single women who are Democrats and single women who are Republicans, you've got a problem, because you have to learn this gentle relationship between justice and mercy, I think, in a marriage. I think that's the only way you learn it. But if you have a lot of unmarried women, as you have in the Democratic Party, it's going to move all the way to mercy. And so they can't understand why we wouldn't open the borders, why we wouldn't be infinitely sympathetic to the transgender movement, to Hamas, all the rest. It's a really wild time. And I think until we get marriage right, until we get father in the home right, we're not going to fix this.
Yeah, well, they won't arrest, somebody for shoplifting in San Francisco if it's less than $1,000. It's
Right.
so ridiculous. And Joshua, you mentioned MAGA, but the person who I see who is really standing tall against all of this is Andrew and Tristan Tate.
Yeah. So the problem, I'll sound like Tocqueville for a minute.
Yeah.
Tocqueville thought that marriage had to recognize the differences between men and women.
Yeah.
There's moral and intellectual equality, but you really have to recognize the differences. But you've got an equality culture right now that absolutely rules out the differences. And so what happens, and think about a blown up balloon. It's equal in all of its aspects until you squeeze the middle, and then the outside blows up. And so if you don't allow healthy differences between men and women, you get unhealthy caricatures of both masculinity and femininity. So Andrew Tate on the one side, female, I don't remember the term they use, where you get a window into their bedroom and you watch them have sex with 1,000 men. So you have these horrible characterizations of both masculinity and femininity, because it's not allowed in public discourse to say, no, there really are differences between men and women, whatever the similarities. So the Andrew Tate phenomena does not surprise me. And then I would add, because this younger generation of boys has been told there's no such thing as masculinity. They know it, there is, but they've been taught that. So on the internet, you can find, as it were, caricatures of masculinity. So we're in a great big cultural mess. The politics of this for me are, as people famously say, it's downstream of the cultural issues. Trump may be in office for 4 years, Vance may be another 4, but none of this really gets solved until we get back to thinking about what a man is, what a woman is, what a family is. That children really need to be a very high priority for us as a civilization. And since 1945, we've had this really weird arrangement. And I think we'll look back on this 30, 40 years and we'll say, this is first time in history. What's the first time in history? After 1945, because the nuclear bombs, conventional war was over. So male as protector, that's gone. And then, of course, you have the claim that we're living amidst a population bomb. And so there's a pushback against women having children at all. Now, no war, no children, this is not history. So I think history gets restarted at some point, and then people realize, you don't solve the problem of male violence by getting rid of masculinity. You solve the problem of male violence by having stronger men that will keep the weaker men in check. You have to have male masculinity to keep civilization intact.
Yeah, I think part of part of being a man is just learning how to master yourself. I agree with Jordan Peterson, who he says, don't fear strong men, fear weak men.
Yeah.
It is very much a caricature, where men would learn learn that discipline and learn some self-control. It's the ability to mediate and get something done. It doesn't help either that I don't think we have positive examples of masculinity. I can go back and think about Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, or Andy
right.
or Andy Griffith, I think Andy Griffith is just one of the great TV dads. And now then you end up with Tim Walz, and I said this is a combination of Curly and Homer Simpson, and he's running for vice president.
Right. I know the references, especially Curly. It was one of my favorites.
Yeah. But that was just comedy. It was silly, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's, and there are some, because one of the messages, from some of these guys like Tate is they'll say, go out there, work out, take care of yourself, be a better, be a good man at least, I think I do think that this I think it's rather silly when you feel like you have to buy 20 cars, but
Yeah.
I mean you can be a rich man and be like Warren Buffett, and still live a pretty simple life, but
Yeah.
There is very much this emphasis, on just being, because some of the, especially in the red pill communities, the guys will say chase excellence, not women. It's
Yeah.
but
Yeah. So for a time, I did do some weightlifting in my 40s, and I realized, boy, that's a lot of calories you're burning. Why don't you work with your hands and build something out on your property? And I think that's the problem. Is this energy directed toward lifting weights? No, it needs to be energy directed toward building a world for others. And there isn't. Well, actually, I'll say there's something very interesting that's happening, which is, there's this push toward digital, but at the same time, and I say this as somebody who's restored a house for the last 5 years, the trades, the analog world of actually fixing things and building things has been decimated. And what we're going to see, I think, is a return to the analog world of things. There's, tens and tens of millions of homes in America. We don't have enough plumbers, enough roofers, et cetera. And I think those guys are going to emerge as the heroes at some point, because they can now command whatever price they want. These guys are making $150,000, $200,000 a year, way more than someone coming out of Georgetown in conflict resolution studies. So I think we're seeing a necessary shift from digital back to analog.
Well, that's really a shift in some ways, to going back to pioneer America when, a man just had to figure out how to do everything, whether it be build a house or, dig the wells or, and I think sometimes when we've gotten removed, and maybe it doesn't help that we've gotten so removed from that, gotten removed from, my grandfather, still went and had a job at the glass factory and still grew food on his yard. It's, I know another guy who's really gotten into gardening and he just loves it. He just, and that can be a real workout, or going and working out on cars. And maybe I think, maybe if we let boys do things like that, whether, build a tree house or even.
Yeah, I agree. So in the Depression, there were conflicting accounts of how many people were out of work, but say 20, 25%. But still, even if they weren't bringing in money, they had chickens and a garden patch and the rest. And now I'm stunned by the younger generation of men who literally cannot do anything. They don't know how to plant a garden. They don't know how to build a fence. They certainly don't know how to tear an engine apart. This is a big problem. It's, again, a crisis of competence. And the great dream from the progressive era forward is we don't need citizen competence. We can have expert competence. And we'll just, citizens can be consumers. That is, in my view, the deepest pernicious aspect of the progressive movement. It evacuated citizen competence very deliberately because it said we were not up to it. And I think if we want to return to the Founders' Constitution, which was limited government based on citizen competence, if we want to have a budget that is not $1 trillion over every year, we literally have to return to citizen competence. And part of this is Doge and the rest. But frankly, and I would say to your viewers, all of us have to step up and ask, how can we improve our own competence? Because my view is it's 150 million men and whatever 140 million women. It's actually more than that for both. All of us have to step up and say, how can we improve our competence? And slowly but surely we can win back the limited government. But it's not just about Doge, it's citizen competence.
Yeah, I wonder where that is too. The fact that we don't even seem to know our neighbors anymore, and we've become very disconnected with, and just.
Well, the internet is the internet's a big problem here. Let me just give you an example. So, as I mentioned, we've been spending 5 years restoring this old 1830s farmhouse, and I needed some wood. I didn't want to buy it at the lumber yard. I wanted wood that came from a tree, and so I go online. And I find a mill up in Maryland. And it's 2.5 hours away, and I load the trailer, and it's kind of a harrowing drive back with 2,000 pounds of lumber on a trailer, and I come in a different way, and it's a street, a mile from me, and there's a guy in his front yard with a sawmill. Instead of looking around in my neighborhood to solve my problems, I go online. It's a very, very sobering lesson. And what I tell my young kids in the Tocqueville class is, instead of going online, just go out, explore your neighborhood, say hello to people, see what's out there. There's all sorts of gems, both in terms of people and of services that are out there. And none of us know this because we think the digital world is going to provide the answers that we're seeking. And to cite Bob Woodson, who's both a dear friend and I think one of the great Black thinkers in America today, he says, the answers to the problem of every community are to be found in that community, not the government, to be found in that community. And we need to start thinking that way.
Yeah, that's often the case. I remember, I remember when I was working years ago it's when I was working at a small company that's not around anymore, but I said, hey, and first thing I did when I found out I needed a new place to live, I told everybody at work. And so a few minutes later, the guy goes, hey, my mom's got a place. So, guy I work with, just like that, it's like we don't remember how to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And people actually almost look at you like you're weird now when you're doing that,
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's really still how most good jobs are found. I mean,
yeah, I think it's crazy to go online and sign up for a job that 100 million people are going to see. One of the things I tell my students is that the problem is the habits that we have. And you're saying that too, but let me give you an example. I say to them, there's no way you're going to have a free society if you're text messaging one another. Why? Because a text message is a very interesting thing. You send something off, and then when somebody's in the mood or somebody has something sassy to say, they respond. Liberty is built in face-to-face spontaneous relations where you don't know what you're going to say. You don't know what the person's going to say back to you. And so this real-time back and forth where you can make mistakes, where you have to correct without, sinking into yourself and thinking about something witty to say. If we can't have that, we can't have liberty. I mean, a very famous passage in Tocqueville is this: feelings and ideas are renewed, the heart enlarged, the mind expanded, only by the reciprocal actions of citizens one upon another. It's real-time, face-to-face relations. And if you've got young people who are scared to do that and will only text message, it's over. It doesn't matter which political party wins. It's over.
I find that so interesting, and it is kind of troubling that that people just can't seem to talk to one another. It's like and I think also it's almost like too that there's so much out there that everybody's kind of overwhelmed with it.
Yeah, so that's why I tell my kids my students at Georgetown, they need to get off of Instagram because they've got digital data from all over the world piling into their little minds and overwhelming them. And read a book, turn it off, and find some balance. After the Civil War, we lost a generation of men to morphine addiction because of all the battle wounds. A lot of people died, but a lot of people lost arms and legs. And I think we are losing. I won't say we've lost. I think we're losing a generation now who don't have a morphine addiction, but they literally have a social media addiction. That's a problem. I tell them to get off of it. They're stunned. I ask them, are you going to do it? And they all shake their head and say, no, we like our addictions. It's a problem.
And in some cases, it's all they know. I don't know. I think social media could have been, it really, as you said, it's become the substitute. And I have to admit, I learned, for example, in the late 90s that trying to do online dating, this is a disaster. I already know it is because it's just not, because nobody takes it seriously. But, this is, you've also talked, about how supplements become substitutes. And I look at some things like, my dad, born in 1931, could multiply two-digit numbers in his head as fast as I could punch them into a calculator.
Yeah.
And it's just like, we don't have this anymore. Well, now we've got all these machines to do things for us. And it's like, I don't see this as a necessarily positive step, because like, what happens when this goes away, you know?
Yeah. So this is the last third of my book, American Awakening, has received probably the least attention. But if you ask me what part will be talked about 30 years from now, it's the section on supplements becoming substitutes. It's a very, very deep problem. If I can just frame it in Tocquevillian terms. So I've said some of this already. I mean, Tocqueville thought that as we move from the aristocratic age to the democratic age, if we wanted to avoid what could be called the gentle tyranny at the end of time, we had to develop competence in these mediating institutions, in our families, in our local neighborhoods, in our churches, in our friendship groups, probably in our educational institutions as well. And so it's been recognized for some time, really since after World War II, that slowly but surely these mediating institutions are atrophying. So Robert Putnam writes a book called Bowling Alone. You know, the Fred Flintstone story, you might remember, is that we got all these men in bowling leagues and now there's no more bowling leagues. So it's been recognized for a long time that these mediating institutions are just generally atrophying. My argument is there's two additional threats which we really need to recognize. The first one, very briefly, is identity politics, because identity politics says that the conventional family is heteronormative, that the church, as it's been historically understood, is homophobic. So there's a secondary, aside from the atrophy of these mediating institutions, the second threat is that identity politics is deliberately dismantling them because they're impure. The third threat is this substitutes or supplements becoming substitutes. And probably, I can give you a good example. So my boys are generally very competent. They can tear apart an engine, and not many can. But my youngest was really born on the cusp of the digital revolution, and he can't get anywhere without Google Maps. So navigation is a competency. And you can use Google Maps as a supplement to this competence of navigation, but it cannot become a substitute for it, because if Google Maps goes down, you got a problem. Driverless cars is another example. I mean, I have a 2-hour drive in from the Eastern Shore to Washington. Sure, I'd love to occasionally have a driverless car so I can read or do my email or something like that. But I want it as a supplement to my competence. If you raise a generation of kids that do not know how to drive, and then you've got driverless cars, somebody just flips the switch and you starve to death in your front hallway. You're not going to the grocery store or any place. So we're making a tremendous wager that what I call digital substitutism, which has all the digital algorithms that were once performed by our own competence. You turn this way when this happens, you turn this way when this happens. All this has now been turned into an algorithm. And what this means is we're now adding a third threat to the competencies that Tocqueville thought we needed to develop in the mediating institutions. It's a very, very serious problem. And while I'm very happy that Doge and some of the tech guys are behind an effort to dismantle DEI, I think the general disposition is, well, let's just double down on this digital substitutism. And we don't need to have human competence. AI will take care of all of our problems. This is, in my view, a disastrous nightmare, which I think will eventually show itself as a disastrous nightmare. But even the people who want to dismantle the identity politics stuff on the left, a lot of them are supporting this digital substitutism. And I think it's a very, very bad idea.
Joshua, the thing that gets me, and I just want to scream sometimes when it happens. I still carry cash. I still will occasionally pay cash. And these people who, I know they're not making a lot of money, but they are completely and totally, they don't know what to do. They look at me like if I have a bill that's like $7.25 and I give them $10.25, they're asking me why you're giving me that quarter. It's like, I just want to.
Yeah. Math. So what we've done is we've turned away from.
And it's more, and I think it's more just because they're lazy.
Well, they've been taught that the thing that they need to figure out is their intersectional score, like who's the innocent victim, who's the transgressor. Look, we need to go back. It's very simple. You want to break the cost of education by a factor of 3. we teach writing, reading, and arithmetic. That's what we teach. We teach them great books. We teach them to memorize the two-digit multiplication tables. And I can still do a lot of that in my head. I learned it in fourth grade. But we have to return to basic competencies, destroy the administrative level that's on top of the educational system, which is really all about coddling young people. And we will find that education works again. We have to develop basic competencies in reading, writing, and arithmetic.
And it's not a matter of IQ, because I can go to Mexico and other places. And those people still know how to handle cash. They do.
Yeah.
It's just these
Right.
coddled Americans who, I worry about what's going to happen with a lot of this stuff. And we have so much of what I would call superficial technology nowadays, and I'm talking about things like electric pencil sharpeners or power windows on the car.
Right.
It doesn't really, there's really no benefit to this. And, when we've seen a lot of this come in, and it's just what they're.
So I will tell you a story along these lines. When I was growing up, we probably did have a dishwasher, but my mother insisted that after dinner, all the kids, three of us, we would wash and dry the dishes together. And I will say, looking back on it, that was one of the most important formative events in my youth. And I have recently boycotted the dishwasher. I say, if we have a dinner party, then everybody pitches in. We all wash, we all dry. The people who know where things go put things away. You're right that we've got the superfluous technology, which was supposed to save us. But the problem is, if you've got a dishwasher and then let's let's keep adding appliances. Well, then you need a big house to put it in, and then you need a job that will pay the mortgages. So I've gone back to, as much as I can, to simplicity. So when we were building this house, we lived in what we call the dog shed. It was 15 by 40. For 2 years, we heated by a wood stove and cooked on a wood stove. We had an outdoor shower, which we used down to about 37, and then we would go to the Y. My electricity bills were $7 a month. And now we've got this restored farmhouse, and with all the technology that's necessary to run it, a big vacuum cleaner. I mean, the whole 9 yards. And I want to go back and live in the dog shed. I want simplicity. I want to be able to think. I want to be able to write. I want to be able to enjoy life. But all these conveniences now, which were supposed to save us time, give us no time. And we have to push back against this.
Sometimes it really does seem that way, that maybe we're not really benefiting from these things, And I regret to say, I occasionally ask around. I've never learned how to drive a manual transmission, and it's, that, and if I ever decide to go abroad, it's a lot harder. You get a lot more cars with manuals now abroad. It's just the way it is.
I agree. I love manual transmission. You can't find them these days.
Yeah, it gets to a point, where we no longer have the choice. And sometimes I think there's, I really almost seem like some of these things are in a way, a conspiracy. I think, for example, they're really trying to get us off of real computers and onto either iPads or phones. I don't think they want us to use our computers anymore.
Yeah, and on the education front, I think one of the great disasters of the last 10 years was the belief that our young people can learn on glass screens. It's a terrible, terrible idea. So how do we learn? We learn with the sensory apparatus that's next to what we're focusing on. So we learn a book by turning its pages, by hearing the sound of the turning pages, by smelling the type, the print. And ancient cultures, and still some of the ancient cultures that are still around us today, have these rituals. So when they want to remember something, they'll have a tea ceremony, because the young people who heard the stories have associated with them the smell and taste of the tea. And so to reproduce the memory, they have to do all the ancillary sensory stuff. So my view is the glass screen has been the kiss of death to a civilization, and we need to go back to face-to-face relations. Now, can the glass screen be a supplement? Of course it can be a supplement. It cannot be a substitute for real knowledge. And we've got an almost illiterate generation coming up because school administrators thought that the best way to proceed was to give everybody an iPad. Just ridiculous.
Well, I understand, but I also look at how much easier and cheaper it is, for example, to produce ebooks. Not to mention, if you haven't moved recently, you'll suddenly appreciate ebooks because those books are heavy.
I agree, but so here's my look. I agree with you, but I think what that forces you to do, or what it should force us to do, is to say, yeah, you don't want to have superfluous books. So I've taught. I would say there's 12 books that have absolutely shaped my life, and I
Yeah.
teach those. And I have for 32 years. So my view is, yeah, books are heavy, but pick out 12 to 20 that will be your guides for the rest of your life, and that's cheap. Books are cheap. You can get Plato's Republic for
Yes.
$20, and for less than $1,000 and maybe even $500, you can get the 12 to 16 of the greatest books of Western civilization. Keep reading them. I remind you, Abraham Lincoln, one of the great orators of the 19th century, was raised on the Bible and Shakespeare. So I do think, we have to make hard choices and we have to make prudential choices. But my view is, and I tell my students this: if you have not left Georgetown with 12 hardcover books that you will love for the rest of your life, you have wasted $300,000. That's what I tell them.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's $300,000. Yeah. Not to mention the cost of having you're also dealing with a place that's very expensive to live, and
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah.
yeah. What? That's a great point. And I have to admit, I used to go to a lot of library sales, and that's certainly a good way to accumulate books fast. But I remember also one reason, as you talked about competence. Anytime I would see a math book before 1970, I would buy it because I just know how math books have gotten dumber over the years.
Yeah.
And maybe it was yeah.
The textbook industry is actually a very serious culprit here. There's a lot of money made on textbooks. People are replacing them every few years. I get routine calls from, textbook companies that want to sell me surveys of the history of political thought. And I explain to them, the people who are destroying our civilization are the ones who want to teach it with little bits of this and little bits of that. My view is that if you want to learn mathematics, you probably should go back to some of the great mathematicians and maybe read Euclid and a whole bunch of others. And that's how you get a true foundation in mathematics. And no, we will not do an extract from Plato's Republic. We're going to read the whole book. So I think democratic impatience, to use Tocqueville's phrase, is actually a very, very big problem. We don't have the patience to settle in with the few things that we love and make them the foundations of life. Tocqueville says there's a restlessness that hangs on the American brow. We're always moving. And one of the great challenges to all of us is to sit still with the things that we love and cherish. And so few of us can do this because it's constant temptation to move from one thing to another.
I'm curious. Have you ever read the Kaczynski Manifesto?
I haven't, but I've heard that the weird thing about it is there's actually some very cool things in it. Whatever else happened.
Yeah, he's talking about how we're getting disconnected, and this was his way of getting reconnected. Obviously, I don't condone what he did, but
yeah,
he was a very intelligent man and certainly saw what was wrong with academia 30 years ago. And this is the thing too, about the doubling down, Joshua. I can remember back in the late 80s, early 90s, there were a lot of books calling out, political correctness at the time. And all of those books were basically ignored. Thomas Sowell had Inside American Education.
Alan Bloom, Closing the American Mind.
Martin Anderson had a book called Imposters in the Temple. And then there were a few others. Yeah.
This is, I was a student of Alan Bloom back in graduate school.
Oh, wow.
And then came to Georgetown. And, I've been haunted by what he wrote in the 80s, 87 or so. And I've watched as for lack of a better word, as the university has lost its understanding of its primary role, which is to convey to young people the beauty, depth, and agony of our historical inheritance. And again, I teach history of Western political philosophy. These books are beautiful books. I call them sometimes brilliant failures. They have terrible mistakes in some cases. But this is our inheritance. And what has happened in the last, well, so when I went to graduate school, even people who were in political science or even the engineering school, they all had a humanities core that they could make reference to. And what's happened is hyper specialization and frankly the politicization of the humanities has just poisoned the humanities. And now you have people, say in political science where I am, who've come through, they've never read the Republic, they don't even know what the Federalist Papers are, they have no idea of political theory, and as a consequence they don't have a deep knowledge. And so what's happening now is in the discipline of political science is it's all activists coming down the pipe. Their task is not to understand Western civilization in all its depth and glory and agony, but really to overcome it. It's a huge problem. And I don't know how it gets fixed.
Why don't they understand that if they destroy civilization, that's going to destroy the colleges too? I mean, we can't really have colleges without a civilized society. And if they just undermine civilization, the colleges are going to go down with it.
That's true, and maybe they're on the verge of that. The reason why it worked for so long was the national government was used as a bank for the left-wing causes that the university professors were advancing. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that's happening right now is that the left hasn't realized it yet, but the basic rule, and I think Trump is right, is look, you can teach what you want, but you can't use federal dollars to advance an expressly political position. And if you abide by that maxim, boy, the universities are just going to get gutted. So you've got here a once in 100-year opportunity to completely reconfigure the higher education and the K through 12 education. And while I'm nervous about I don't know, I'm not going to call it violence, but the rate at which all this stuff is being ripped apart. A Tocqueville scholar understands the fragility of all these institutions. But I also know, and back to your point about the authors in the 1980s, people have been warning about this for 40 years, longer. And the left has said, we don't care. We're not listening to you. And now I'm to the point where I think, well, the only thing you're going to listen to is the removal of your funds. And I hate to do that. I hate to dismantle the university, but I'm so livid about what's happened. And I've lived through this, and I'm persona non grata at the university I teach in, and I have been for 15 years. This is not pleasant. And our students, I think, know there's more. Many of them are deeply dissatisfied, but they don't see any intellectual alternative to the identity politics stuff they're taught.
Yeah, I don't know either. And it does seem to be more of a problem, some of the more elite and prestigious, and, taking the money away. I don't think Harvard will notice at all. I don't know
No,
what
Harvard
Georgetown's endowment is, but
yeah. So this, by the way, is a big change. So, when I started at Georgetown, the endowment was very small. And what that meant was they had to focus on educating undergraduates. And that meant they had to be responsive to the citizen mood. But as these universities have become more and more wealthy because of their endowments, they don't have to rely on tuition dollars. And so they can teach whatever they want. They're immune. And that's, I think, part of the reason why these universities have gone farther and farther left, is there's no response. They don't need to respond to the fact that more than half the country has had it up to here with this identity politics stuff. So, I can't speak too much about Georgetown. Propriety requires that I'm somewhat careful, but I don't see any evidence at Georgetown or any other university that I know that there are people in high places that are saying maybe we've gone too far. I don't see the slightest bit of evidence in that.
But I think you also might end up in a situation, where maybe 100 years ago, somebody goes out and, gets rich and then says, oh, I want to thank my college. So they give a nice big donation to their college. But some of these colleges, I know a guy who went to RPI, and he said RPI couldn't get money from their alumni at all, and that just tells you their experience there must not have been that good, you know.
Yeah. So on that matter, in the 1990s, conservatives began to realize that when they give a lot of money to a university, donor intent is rapidly violated. So they give, $4 million for an endowed share in conservative thought, and within 5 years, it's something completely different. And so conservative donor money completely dried up. That's the first thing. The second thing is a lot of these institutions are now, they're not even tapping into their conservative base, because from 1968 on, and that's the year that's relevant for Georgetown, because that was the year Bill Clinton came through. What's happened is that you've got, a bunch of baby boomers that made a lot of money. They're largely on the left. Are there conservative alums in many of these places? Yeah, they are. But the fundraising apparatus of these colleges and universities is literally not looking at all to the conservative donors, because they can get all the money they need from the ones on the left.
Yeah, and it seems like to me, what do you explain, for example, when some of these people don't seem to be following the course of their parents. I mean, I don't, Jordan Peterson obviously I think has some great things
Yeah.
to say, but I look at his daughter Michaela, and she's already on. She got married, had a kid, got divorced, and now is on a second marriage. It's like, okay, what's going on here? Because it seems like, and you hear a lot of these stories of the conservative parents sending their kids off to college. It's like, what happened to my kid?
Well, this is a huge problem. I mean, you're not going to have a healthy society by having one of its units healthy and the rest unhealthy. So you can have a great family, but if your universities are crazy, it's a problem. And so a healthy society is an interlocking mesh of institutions, all of which are more or less healthy. But while I'm not sympathetic at all to the public school system, when the family breaks down and teachers have to be parents in the classroom, that's asking of them too much. So when each of these institutions begins to break down, they're not mutually reinforcing one another. They're usurping, they're taking on the role of these other institutional forms, and they can't. So it's a very, very big problem. I mean, we clearly need, let's call it a civilizational renewal, because what we're doing is not working.
I know one lady who looks into a lot of this, and she mentions that really all of this is just about promoting some type of Marxism. They've just repackaged it. I mean,
So I think it's a little different. So that I hear this argument on the right that it's cultural Marxism, the long, slow march of the institutions. I actually think that's not right, because I'll tell you, I mentioned that I was a student of Bloom's. I was right there, late 80s, Berlin Wall falls. And what happened at the university was very, very interesting, because up until 89, it was really dominated by the Marxists. But what happened after 1989 was the Marxists realized intellectually there's nothing there. And what happened then was you have, and I know you've heard this phrase, the postmodern group come in. And that group intellectually is indebted to Nietzsche, not Marx, to Germans, but to Nietzsche, not to Marx. And my argument is that identity politics is not Marxism. And we have to be very careful, because when you use the term cultural Marxism, there's something in the back of your head or back of your heart that says, well, we defeated it kind of before, and so now we don't have to worry about it. No, I think this is much more pernicious. So Marxism's central category is the category of class. And there's a tradition in American thought that said Marxism will never really capture America, because Americans have wealthy, but they don't have class like Europe has class. So what about identity politics? Well, its central category is guilt. And Americans, because they're religious people, boy, that hits them very, very hard. And with Marxism, there was supposedly a long, slow march through the institutions. But with identity politics, it raced through. I mean, this didn't really start in earnest until the middle of the Obama administration, maybe 2010. So this is a different thing than Marxism. And I don't doubt that there are lefties who call themselves Marxists and defend identity politics. But I don't give the left the right to declare what they think they are. So they say they're progressives. They're not progressives. Progressivism died. What they are is identitarians. It's all identity politics. They're still talking about being Marxists and about progressives, but I think people on the right, or people who are, forget that, people who are fed up with the delusions of the left, and here I will count myself. I think they have to not give an inch on this. They're not progressives. They're not Marxists. They're identitarians, and identitarians are interested in finding the least stain and destroying it.
Some would say, and I've had Rudyard Lynch on here a few times. He just says they're just obsessed with destruction. They just want to destroy everything. There's no, and I think almost in some ways that came to light 5 years ago at this time. Oh, let's destroy society and destroy our relations and destroy businesses and destroy jobs over nothing.
Yeah. So I mentioned Nietzsche a minute ago, and I'm not a Nietzschean, but boy, he got the diagnosis right in the 1880s. And what he said was, a civilization that no longer believes in itself becomes nihilistic, i.e., it courts death, it courts nothingness. And I think that's the deepest problem, is that so many people have given up on their civilization, and when they do, they just feel utterly betrayed by it, and their only possible reaction to it is destruction. I mean, the Black Lives Matter protest, I think, was part of it. And people said, oh, mostly peaceful protests, $2 billion in insurance claims. This was just the sheer joy of destruction. And the left didn't want to admit that it's involved in that. But, 80% of Americans think that transgenderism is a bridge too far. And the left doubles down on it. A huge proportion think that Hamas brutally murdered Israelis. And whatever your view on that very intractable political contest may be, come on, it was pretty violent. And the left think, no, it's fine. So I think there's a deep pathology in the left mind. I don't like saying that, but first there's no ability to autocorrect. That is the mark of somebody who is not well. They just double down every time. And it really does look like they're not interested in creating and nurturing, because if it's not pure, it must be destroyed. That's the motto of the identity politics. And nothing is pure. And so everything must be destroyed. And I think the transhumanism movement actually is the logical culmination of identity politics, because if all human life and everything that we've done is stained, the only way out of this is to become transhuman. To be uploaded into a computer and to leave all the analog violence and bloodshed that attends being an embodied creature, to leave that behind. And I think that's where the left is ultimately going on this.
That's some very interesting stuff. I think in some cases, there's hope to prolong life, but sometimes it's, but yeah, I'm wondering about all that too. That will end up being something like Darth Vader or something even more.
Yeah.
But something out of sci-fi, and so much science fiction is warned against a lot of these things.
Yeah.
The machines. I mean, I think the whole worship of AIs can do some things, but it's, the thing I always say about self-driving cars is, they say, well, the self-driving car will have less wrecks. I said, yeah, but have you ever thought about how many decisions you make when you're driving a car? Right. 95% of the decisions you make when you drive a car are correct.
Yeah.
And yeah. I don't really know what the left wants anymore, but it seems to be but I think also though, as you said, losing faith in civilization. I mean, I feel like I've lost faith in civilization just because I don't have any faith in my fellow man anymore. It's.
Yeah. I think it's very bleak, and in my own life, I feel it acutely, but America's had very, very dark moments before. And I think this is an invitation to recovery and renewal. And even though I am somewhat worried about some younger men who are kind of tempted by the Andrew Tate thing, I will say in the last year or so, I've met some remarkable young people who have a depth of understanding, have courage, which has been sorely lacking. They're articulate. And I feel, I'm getting older. I feel like my life's labor, which has been to defend this thing called Western civilization for all of its warts, it's going to work out. It's very strange, but I feel like it's going to work out.
There is one man out there, and if you've looked at my shows, uh, Javier Milei.
Yeah, he's remarkable what he's done in Argentina. I agree, and I think that awoke some of the American voters to what's possible in terms of governmental transformation. So that's been quite a story. It's not over.
Well, I just hope that we can occasionally, put out because I don't know where, we may end up going here, but it seems like, and I do wonder, where we go though when we have some, like, South Korea has a, birth rate, fertility rates of less than one per woman and stuff like that. I don't know.
Well, the way I tell it to my students is, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that we've been living in a 70, 80 year bubble where the belief has been population is the big problem. And I tell them, no, the civilization, we are going to lose more people, more percentage of our people in the next 30 years than we lost in the 1300s with the Black Death. Population is going to absolutely collapse. And the future belongs to those who have, I don't know, I'll say the word faith, have enough faith that it'll work out and children are beautiful things. And, when I talk to my young students, the girls especially, they have been raised to think that because of climate change and the lack of social justice in the world, they literally should not have children. This is a catastrophe. The surveys done of women later on in life who've not had children reveal that 90% of them are bitterly disappointed they did not have children. These young girls have been brainwashed to think that this beautiful aspect of their bodies and persons, which is to have children, is something they should be ashamed of. This is a catastrophe. Yeah. I characterize this as similar to the parents that threw their kids in Central America into the volcanoes to appease the gods so that they could feel good about themselves. I mean, this is child sacrifice by another name.
Yeah, Joshua, and the sad truth is, I've got this box of old photos that I want to scan, and it's from my great grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary party, which happened in 1929. Wow. The fact of the matter is, the only people who your great grandchildren, your great great grandchildren, the fact is, nobody else is going to care that you were alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
I care that Plato was alive. I care that Aristotle was alive. But most of us never achieved that. Yeah. The only people who care that my great grandparents were alive are their descendants.
So this is actually going to be very interesting to watch, because you're going to have a generation of young people who have no children that will take care of them in old age. Yeah. No children that will remember them. And I think, to understand the catastrophe that this really is, let's just do a bit of math here. Say civilization goes back 6,000 years, and you have 4 generations each 100 years. That's 250 generations who, in each generation, war, violence, suffering, childhood death, disease, conquest, and nevertheless, they kept going. And here we are with the younger generation that dares to say, none of that mattered. None of that matters. Yeah. The way that I can do good now is not to have children, but to die off. This is evidence of a civilization that is in its death throes.
It really is, scary. It's kind of scary. Well, I think we're getting about to where you need to cut off. Yeah. It's been great talking. I knew you were going to be a great person to talk to here. I should just take every guest that Atlas Society has on, because they have so many good people there. Jag is a great host. I have no qualms about praising these other people, and it's been great having you on. Too.
Thank you.
You have anything else to say before we go? And
I do have hope. I mean, I think we need to have a very, very sober diagnosis. But civilization has been on the verge of death many times, Western civilization, and somehow, something new has emerged, and there's been continuity. And I do believe we'll get there, but it's probably not for you and I to fully understand. We just have to identify the problem and keep fighting.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, thank you very much. And where can we find you out there?
So I don't actually have, I mean, I have an X account, but I've never posted anything, and I never will. It's just to watch. But
And
I'm
I
at
got
Georgetown.
I got your info off the Georgetown pages. It's getting harder to find people's. It used to be 20 years ago you could find any academic's email address, but it's getting harder to do that now. But
Yeah, well, I'm on the web at Georgetown.
Yeah. And so, hopefully things will get better out there. I got to. Well, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, go buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack and go to buy me a coffee. Thank you, Joshua Mitchell. I'm Chris Baker.
My pleasure.
We're out. Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to the Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Support the forum. Go to buymeacoffee.com/fountainheadforum. Thank you.